Can you tell us a little about how you developed your Board of Trustees? How was this different from working with the local authority control?
Well, it's massively different. It's very different. It is very. I've really enjoyed working with the Board of Trustees because it's a very different process because all those trustees, you've if you like you've selected or you've appointed, and they're therefore there's I think it's important to be very honest with your trustees. That it's not just coming to a meeting. It's about rolling your sleeves up and taking part.
Yeah.
Because for all the 50 people who are Banbury Museum and the community, our objective is to invigorate, develop, to deliver our vision and our ambition. So it's very hands-on, and you need to be committed. So all our trustees have been amazing in doing that. Those that in the early days, we still got trustees from the very first day we became a trust to now, and we've had some changes, obviously. But working with board trustees has been fantastically rewarding because, well, it's awe-inspiring how much they offer and give, and I think it's when you begin when you develop a trust and run a museum through a trust, you can only survive and develop if you've got all this support, because there's no big sort of body behind you to prop you up. So your relationships with people are very important, and all of us carry that responsibility. So that's fun. It's very different from a local authority, of course, because your members, elected members, they're selected to be involved in the museum, and of course they can be voted off, and they're also subject to the politics. That's a very different way of working. Your elected members, I suppose, are like your and senior officers are like your board, but it's a much more difficult environment to work in a local authority, because you haven't necessarily got you haven't got the same level of commitment or skill. So,
or even the same goals in many cases.
No, because of course they'll be carrying the local authority goals, whatever they are. So the advantage of why I really enjoy working at a trust is that we all sign up the vision together. It is absolutely a community exercise. We're all in it together, developing the plans together. Everyone is, everyone is involved, and that's absolutely the way it should be. So you get that sort of support and commitment to make those changes.
How did governance arrangements affect the service?
Obviously, it makes a fundamental difference, and it's a really sort of powerful new opportunity. But it also requires you to set up new infrastructure to support that governance. So you've moved from, or are moving from, a local authority context where your way or your overall governance is reporting through to cabinet member, or occasionally council, and occasionally you're going to present as a head of department to scrutiny committee or to cabinet, and very, very occasionally to council, depending on, again, your local authority. So Hampshire and Winchester obviously were quite different in that regard, but it's the same process. It's mainly through written reports and through conversation at events and that sort of thing, that you have your sort of contact with your governance, as in the people who are making the decisions. And I think in moving to an independent organisation, one of the really exciting opportunities, and this is again not a criticism of local government, it's just the way it is, one of the really exciting opportunities is that you are much closer to that decision making reference board, and also they are much closer to the team and to what the team is doing and the consumer and the customer and so on. So immediately you are moving from a scenario where you are a very small part of a much bigger decision-making process that's looking at dustbins and environment and, adult social care and children's services, to one where the governance is focused in on what you're doing and the public value, again, that you are bringing to the community of Hampshire, and is in the same way that councils are and councillors are, but in a different way as well. They are driven by that passion for that public value and that community spirit. So I think immediately you notice that difference, and that difference in energy and interest. So it definitely impacted in that way. Decision making much closer, knowledge much closer. The structures needed to be established. So how did we do that? We set up a shadow board of a small group of trustees. So the two local authorities, Hampshire County Council and Winchester City Council, agreed to hand appoint, so not go to open recruitment, for the first 5 trustees. And this was informed by research and learning that we undertook elsewhere. So we went to other trusts that had already been established. We looked at how they had established themselves, looked at the lessons learned from them. And one of the lessons learned was, when you're actually making the transition, don't make your trustees group too big, and make sure you've got the right skills in to be able to make that transition step as powerfully and robustly as possible. Have a really strong chair. So that was a really key part of the process for Hampshire County Council and Winchester City Council. Have 2 really strong local authority presences on that council, so one for each of them. So you've got that ability to communicate at the highest levels in this setting up stage, and have I think we had 2 others at that stage, really strong, really experienced cultural people who reflected on, I think we had 3 actually, reflected on people, commercial, arts, museums, and the sort of community aspects of things, and were up for the transition process, but also were able to scrutinise it rigorously and robustly as well. So we had a shadow board for about 6 months, I think, before we went to transition. They would review all of the legal documentation. We set up, governance structure around sort of regular meetings and reporting, etc., into all of that. And they made decisions that mirrored the council's decisions according to the timetable. And then, of course, they took on responsibility. And at that point, we undertook a skills audit to identify what other kind of skills were needed to be on the trust board. And at that point, we went out to open recruitment to appoint those other trustees to make it up to, I think, 11 at that first stage. You need capacity to support the governance properly, and that's part of the building the plane while you're flying it. There's definitely work on compliance and governance that take shape, but that gives you a bit of an overview, I think.
Governance seems to be a critical part of any successful museum or cultural enterprise. How did your new governance arrangements, such as the board of directors, impact the service?
Interesting question. I completely agree. Governance is incredibly important. It's not very glamorous, I have to say. So a number of times some of my colleagues have said, why are you so interested in governance? I'm saying because it's necessary. And it is absolutely necessary. So we have a board of 7 directors. They're not trustees, we're not a charity, so it's 7 directors. 5 of those are what are termed independent directors, and 2 of them are local authority nominees. There's 2 nominees actually as a council officer, one from Ealing, one from Hounslow. But the majority of the board are independent. The chair of the board is drawn from that independent cohort, and the current chair is somebody with a business background. 2 of the other independents also come from a business background. And I think that is important to reflect the necessity of the CIC to be entrepreneurial and commercial. But I do think one of the observations I would make is we're actually a little bit light on directors with experience of or a track record in our core business. So of the people on my board, the 7 people on my board, I've got a council officer who has run leisure and culture services before, and I have a retired ex-council officer who's run leisure and cultural services before. But what we don't have on the board is, for example, an ex or somebody who's a museum director. And I do think occasionally that has proven to be a challenge at times in terms of ensuring that that service provision is front and centre throughout the organisation. It's absolutely front and centre to me and my staff. When we get into board discussions, sometimes there can be a drift into the commercial, possibly at the expense of the service focus, and that is actually on occasions can be significant tension. I find myself sometimes having to advocate on the part of the service at board, and the directors are great and they will take that advocacy and they will go, absolutely, you're right. But it has been things like having to bring directors in and getting them to do tours of back of house at the museum to try and understand what a curator does, to try and understand the value and complexity of conservation work. What they tend to see is the visitor experience. They see something in a case or they see an interpretation plaque and they go, oh, that's very interesting. But what they don't understand is what sits behind that. And what sits behind that is cost. And what sits behind that is talent and expertise. One, they have to understand that that cost is not a mere overhead, that actually it's a necessary cost and investment in that service. And the second thing, they have to see that curators, conservators, they actually are really technical professions. And if you've never been around that, sometimes I think some of the directors either can take it for granted that, oh, well, that's what you do, David, you manage those people. But actually, everybody in the organisation occasionally needs to feel that the board values them, that understands their work. And I think my advice to anybody doing this again would be perhaps to get a slightly better balance around the board in terms of expertise. What I would say is, when I took the job, the 2 local authorities very much said, we need to make sure that the CIC is business-like. So what we need you to do is help us to recruit people from a business background. They were right, it needed to show that it was different than public sector provision. But in ever of these things, it's about balance. And I think perhaps they didn't quite get the balance right initially. So I think what we'd be looking at, certainly as the board refreshes, is looking at who's coming onto the board with possibly a little bit more eye on, can they bring some credentials around heritage, cultural services, museum services.